Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. No matter where you are joining us from around the world, thank you for joining this session on extreme wildfires. I'm Dr. Christopher Viechotek with FM Global. FM Global is a commercial industrial property insurance company that believes that resiliency is a choice. And I strongly believe in that notion as well. I'm going to start today by asking you to answer a couple questions. So I'm going to ask you to use the chat feature in Zoom. So if you don't have your chat window open, please click on the bottom of your screen and open your chat window so you can participate. Now, the first question I want to ask all of you is, what elements of your community do you think are critical to making it resilient? Elements can be buildings, can be parts of infrastructure, can be resources. Whatever your thoughts are, I would love to hear them. I got colleagues also culling the questions and the answers so we get to see if there's some trends in the responses. Fresh water, egress routes, very important. What about places like hospitals, your homes, companies and businesses that provide for that neighborhood or that community? Cell phone signal, that's a really good one. So these are all key aspects to a resilient community. Now I'm going to ask you to do me a favor. Close your eyes. Picture that element that you just wrote down or thought about. Now imagine it gone. Now imagine your whole community gone because of one event, a wildfire. Now you can open your eyes. What kind of resiliency is there if the whole community is gone? When we talk about resiliency, we want to ensure that people have something to return to, whether it's their homes, their jobs, their schools. So now let me ask you another question. When you think about wildfires, what regions of the world come to mind? And again, please use the chat function to enter in where you think wildfires happen. What's the first ones that come to your mind? I see a lot in California. Africa, Washington State, yes. And over the past 10 to 20 years, Australia, of course, over the past 10 to 20 years, hundreds of millions of hectares of land have been consumed by fires. Communities have been devastated and lives have been lost. And I think many of you would be surprised to hear that wildfires happen in all the places that you listed, but also have happened recently in Greenland, Norway, Sweden, Greece, Portugal, Brazil. Fires happen all around the world. So today, we are at a community meeting. We are at a town hall meeting. We are not at a session, we're at a town hall meeting. And we are the civic leaders, the elders that the community looks towards, the representatives of our community. And we're gathered together because our residents are concerned. They have questions for us. On the horizon, they can see the smoke. On the distant hillside, they can see the fire. And they're coming to us asking, are we at risk? How extreme is it going to get? What is the plan? And we, as their leaders, need to come up with answers. So we've gathered here together today. And in order to get those right answers, we have invited a world-renowned expert on wildfires, Dr. Janice Cohen, to join us. Before I come up, there she is. Hi, Janice.
Chris, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for joining us. Would you take a moment or two and introduce yourselves to everybody and say hi?
Hi, everyone. I'm Janice Cohen. I've been studying wildfires for over 25 years now. I'm a project scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado, and a senior research scientist at the University of San Francisco. I come from a background of weather, atmospheric science, and my research looks at how wildfires behave by integrating the weather models with fire behavior models to understand how they produce fire phenomena, and also to look at infrared imagery to get a look inside what's going on that fire line and how fire whirls form and burst forward and create a lot of phenomena that are dangerous to firefighters.
Great. Well, thank you for joining us today. And as I was saying, our residents are really concerned in our community. They've been watching the news and they're hearing that wildfires are getting worse and worse and worse. And they're really concerned about the risks. And one of them actually came to me and said, I heard on the news that they're saying that what is extreme today will be normal tomorrow. And they're really worried about that. Can you share some thoughts on what you feel about that statement?
I think you'll find people have a different idea what extreme means. We could define it in terms of loss to human structures. We could talk about how many or how much area has been burned by a fire. And if we look at that metric, then we'll find that a few percent of fires are responsible for 85 to 95% of the area burned. We could also look at natural resources, the severity, the impact on ecosystems of fires. There's different ways of measuring it. And some of these have to do with factors that are changing over time. That is, as humans move into the wildlands and take their infrastructure and ignition sources with them, we see fires are changing. So we might think about weather changing over time, but also humans and our values at risk are changing as well. So it's a very complex system.
I see. So from the sound of it, it sounds like there's some regions that are just naturally prone to wildfires, but in other regions, conditions might be changing that are making wildfires more prevalent now compared to where they were like in the past. Is that correct?
Well, when we look at extreme wildfires, we find that there are two types at the ends of a spectrum. And particularly when we look at the recent California events, some of these events are wind-driven events where fires occur during windstorms, and they might even be ignited by the strong winds interacting with the electrical infrastructure. And the strong winds spread them rapidly into towns. At the other end of the spectrum, which are also very large wildfires, among the largest, are what we call plume-driven events. These are fires that occur in relatively weak wind conditions, conditions that don't necessarily look dangerous, but because of the heat release from the fire, they generate winds that in turn drive the fire. So this interaction between the weather and the fire makes the fire spread rapidly upslope. And those are some of our biggest and most dangerous fires as well. But and we can also have fires that have a combination, or regions that have some plume-driven components, but are also impacted by winds. But in general, our most damaging types of fires are at the end of this spectrum, whether strong winds or weak wind conditions, and the fire-induced winds drive the fire itself.
I see. Now, are there parts of the world, I know you're an expert on in the United States and in Western, Northwest United States. Are there parts of the world that are more prone to these extreme events on either end of the spectrum?
Well, there are certainly communities among mountain ranges that are impacted by downslope winds. And Colorado had a terrible fire season this year. California, as people have mentioned, has had some terrible years recently. Australia has had some bad conditions that are, well, heavy fuel loads, but also driven by frontal passages. So there are certain type of conditions that feed into strong events in certain regions. My colleague Andy Prine at NCAR and I are looking at a history of fire weather in California, and we find in several regions across California there are consistent weather patterns that contribute to daily rapid fire growth. And some, for these dynamic events, these wind-driven events, Andy found that the trend over the past 50 or so years has been for these conditions to have been increasing. So there are some large-scale factors that we can tie to some of the more recent events.
Interesting. Now, also, I know like some communities that might have been built 30, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, that may have been in an environment that wasn't necessarily prone to fires, but now might be more at risk. Can you talk about some of the changes that are occurring that could maybe, you know, put a community that wasn't at risk before to more at risk now?
We've had situations in Colorado where the number of people who might have lived within the city limits are moving up into the mountains because, you know, it's a nice views, a nice environment to have trees outside. And the people who are living in the interface has doubled over my first 20 years here. So even though the community is rooted in the same place, it spreads into the interfaces. Oh, I see Kevin has joined us.
So, thank you, Kevin, for joining. This is Dr. Kevin Tulhurst from Australia. He is our other expert panelist that is joining us today. Thank you for taking the time, Kevin. And
Thanks.
Give you a moment to say hi to everyone and introduce yourself.
Well, yeah. Hi, everyone. So I'm Kevin Tulhurst. So my background, I guess, is in as a forester originally, but my research work in fire has been in fire ecology and particularly in bushfire risk simulation and modelling. So I have a foot in the camp of fire management, fire ecology, as well as bushfire risk management. So a lot of my work's been done in southeastern Australia. So I'm based in Victoria, but I've certainly worked to some extent with people in Europe and America, but I guess that's been fairly marginal compared with my involvement in Australia.
Great. We would love to hear your experience then about Australia and, you know, fire potential in along Asia too. Janice and I were just speaking about, you know, different conditions that are driving extreme wildfires. And sort of the discussion is, are there some regions of the world that are just naturally prone to these extreme events? Or are there also, you know, regions of the world where conditions are changing for one reason or another that, you know, previously maybe a community wasn't at risk, but now is? Do you have any thoughts on those two?
Yeah, so I guess one of the things that's important in Australia in particular, and other parts of Australia that have some Australian eucalypts present, is the extent of spotting. And spotting sort of where embers are carried forward by either the prevailing winds or convective updrafts and create a mass ignition downwind. And that's a typical propagation mechanism in Australia, where we have eucalypt forests. But you'll also see it in places like California. You'll see it in places like Portugal, places where eucalypts have been planted as well, South Africa. So, and what we're seeing, particularly in southern Australia, I guess, is that that flammable environment is being made a whole lot more flammable because of the changing climate that we have. And every time in geological time that there's been a shift in climate, there's also been an increase in the amount of fire. So I'm talking going back millions of years here. So there's a recurring pattern of increase in charcoal in sediments when there's been a change in climate. So part of the reason for that is that in southern Australia, where there's drier conditions emerging, the natural forests and the landscapes are adapting to that drier situation. And what's happening is the biomass that was there before is dying off, and that becomes fuel for fires. And so anywhere where there's been a reduction in rainfall and a shift in the productivity of landscapes, there's more fuel, and therefore fires become more potentially more intense. But we're seeing that combined with more severe weather conditions, so more severe droughts. Driven with droughts, we've also got sort of storm type conditions where we get more unstable atmospheric conditions, and Janice will have done a lot of work with some of the coupled atmospheric models, sort of where instability is such a driver of the process. And as I say, in Australia, with the spotting process, that instability really drives the spotting process, so that the magnitude of the fires, the intensity of the fires, is multiplied several times because of all those factors: more fuel, more severe weather, the changing biomass across the landscape, and and then we put people in the way. So there's the potential for impact is so much greater. So yeah, it's a real issue for us. And I would have to say that generally speaking, we're not dealing with it very well. So it's a major problem that we need to address, is good fire management.
And feeding what Kevin said, some of our most recent destructive events have been a combination of factors, and underlying very high, what we call a vapor pressure deficit. So underlying sustained dryness, on top of which are these troublesome weather patterns that are particularly problematic in some areas. So there are long-term factors on top of which there are short-term, a few day patterns of weather that are trouble.
Mm.
So I know that I'm assuming there's communities wondering out there, that are prone to wildfires, that are wondering, could an event like the Paradise Fire that happened in California in 2018, or the fire down in Australia in 2019, the Malakola, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right.
Malakuta.
Malakuta, yeah. Those really extreme events, could they happen in their community, in their region? What would people, in order to understand, could that happen to them? What are the factors they should be thinking about or considering?
Yeah, well, I'd say in a lot of places, particularly in the Mediterranean, in America, in Southern Africa, yes, you'll certainly be seeing that. There's not only do we have climate change changing the landscapes in terms of what the landscapes can productively carry or sustainably carry, but we've also got land use change. And so we see in places like Europe, America, Australia, Africa, where that land use has resulted in more fuels across the landscape, and probably to some extent fewer people who actually live and work in the landscape. So that shift in demographics as well as land use patterns has also played into the increase in bushfire activity and risk. And you see that manifested in North America, for example, where the structure of forests has changed. The same thing is happening in Australia. The same thing's happened in Europe. So it is a widespread problem, is this change. So Janice, I'm sure you have similar experiences in North America.
I get asked that question, Chris, all the time. Can the campfire scenario happen to my community? And as I look at the airflow and the weather patterns and the microscale wind extrema in that event, it was exceptional for that day compared to any other place along the Sierra Nevadas. The certain conditions between the terrain slope, the winds, and the atmospheric stability that amplified the winds another 10 or 20 miles per hour compared to nearby areas. But there are other issues like that in other places, for example, along the Sierras, further south, where there's some high mortality areas that we saw really get consumed in the creek fire, creating these deep pyrocumulus that went up deep into the stratosphere. So there are certain conditions that are particularly problematic, but these unseasonal downslope windstorms for us in Colorado are always going to be a problem. Typically our windstorms, for example, come in December. So sometimes unseasonal patterns when it sets up like it does in California, when you have short-term wind events over top of a long-term dryness, these are able to create extreme events across a broad swath of our state. And I know I'm speaking locally, but we have Kevin here, an expert from Australia, who can tell you that there are probably similar combinations that contribute to worst case scenarios in Australia.
Yeah, exactly right. And I guess we need to consider the basically 5 sources of energy that fires are able to integrate and capture. We think of fuels as being a primary one, and fuels are important. But as Janice was saying, there's also just the weather conditions, the wind and the temperature and the dryness of the air, the relative humidity. They're 2 fairly obvious ones. Then there's the terrain, where you have complex weather terrain interactions, and fire interactions can greatly increase the severity and scale of the fire. Thirdly, there's the atmospheric instability, and one of the things we're seeing in Australia is the increased amount of instability during fire weather, and so we're getting pyroconvective development in fires, which dramatically changes, feeds back more winds, as well as drier air coming down from higher in the atmosphere, but also provides a mechanism for longer distance ember transport for the spotting process. And the 5th one really is environmental moisture, so or the lack of it, which is to do more with drought. And we're seeing more frequent drought and more severe drought in southern Australia, and that's leading to greater availability of fuel, but also less work that the fire has to do in drying the fuel out when combustion's taking place, so that the fires have more energy to release in the way of heat. And really, I guess, the interaction with the atmosphere.
So both of you have mentioned, these conditions are prevalent in Australia, the US, you mentioned Europe. I haven't heard either of you mention anything about Asia. Do these conditions exist in Asia? Are there, other events there that happen?
Yeah, well, to the best of my knowledge, I guess that there are a lot of other issues happening in Asia, but we're seeing, I guess, a greater occurrence of cyclones, hurricanes, whatever you'd like to call them, which are causing storm damage. And again, that damage from those weather systems create more deadened down material, so there's more fuels when fires do occur. There are complicating factors, I guess, in Asia, where we've got land clearing and a whole lot of use of fire for agriculture and so on. Being in tropical areas, the impact of climate change is not so much one to do with fires, even though there's an element of increased fire activity there, but it's probably not as great as what's happening in the temperate and boreal sort of areas.
Yes, of course, Russia has massive forest fires, and some things we've seen occasionally in recent years are really bad fire years in Alaska, where you don't typically think of large fires, but of course they have very large fires. In years where it's a bad year, their carbon release is comparable to the rest of everything else in the carbon system because of the large underlying permafrost. I'm sure I've got the wrong word for it, but yeah, there. And of course, we have the wind events, and in Greece and France. There's many regions that have their own type of fire issues. And Portugal. We'll talk about that in one of the other sessions. They've had some fantastic wildfires recently that have killed scores of people. It's truly tragic.
So we've been talking about, sort of the hazard and what drives these fires. But I think I want to also talk briefly about, the potential damage from these fires. When people think about a wildfire, I think the immediate assumption is the scorched earth, the burnt down buildings, but wildfires can have a different impact as well. If there's utilities or your public water supply, during the initial survey that we did at the start of the session, it was listed that water, was considered essential to having community be resilient. If your water supply is away from your city, your town might be safe from the wildfire, but your water supply might be up in the mountains or where the wildfires occur. Can you talk about, the potential damages that people don't necessarily consider as being associated with wildfires?
This really hit home in Colorado during the 2002 Hayman fire, which burned in the mountains west of the Denver metro area. Some of the three primary reservoirs that feed Denver were impacted by the fire. And one, the Cheeseman Reservoir, has been dredged out over and over and over in the time since, costing tens of millions of dollars. The culverts replaced. And as the vegetation, since it was burned off, the erosion of the soils on the slopes, it slides down in and fills up the reservoir, destroying the water supply. So that's why you see when you talk about the costs of wildfires, you can talk about the suppression costs, but ultimately the economic impacts can be 10 to 50 times that over decades.
Yeah, so I think often people feel as though they're not being affected by a bushfire unless they've had the flames on their back doorstep. And I think you're quite right, Christopher, in that there are a lot of other impacts. So water is a major one. So in Australia, where water is quite short, there's the issue of water quality and as well as water quantity. Water quality has an immediate impact because the water that you have may become undrinkable because of the amount of sediment and blooms that you might get in the water and so on. So water quality is a major issue. But the other one is water quantity as well, the water yield. So if you have severe fires in a landscape, it can change the vegetation or the forest structure. And forest structure has an influence on how much water is used in the landscape by the vegetation. So that can have an impact for decades. So water is a major one. In Victoria, in Australia, for example, one of the reasons why we have a desalination plant, which costs us a fortune to keep and operate, is a backup for the event that one of our major catchments, water catchments, gets burnt by a severe fire. So that's a massive amount of investment that we've had to make. Canberra fires in 2003 in our capital, it cost them more to put in a water filtration plant to service Canberra after the fire than the total cost of the immediate impact of suppression and impact of the fire on Canberra, just to put in a water filtration plant so as the city had water to drink. But the impact on other critical infrastructure like power lines can be huge. And the one that's been really obvious in the 2019-20 fire season in southeastern Australia has been the impact on human health. More people died from health-related problems from the smoke that came into major cities, major towns, areas, than died from a direct impact from the fire. It was through respiratory problems with the smoke in the atmosphere for weeks. And so that shouldn't be underestimated. So even though you may be tens of kilometres or even hundreds of kilometres away from the actual fire, you still can be impacted by that. And we had major highways blocked for weeks because trees had come down across the road. So that affected our transport of food and other essential goods around the country, especially where those roads were primary roads with very few alternative routes. So yeah, we really need to look much more widely at the direct impact on human life and homes. It has a much bigger impact. Our plantation industry has had a massive impact. So that's one of the industries that's been affected as well. Yeah, so as Janice says, there's probably a 10 to 50 time multiplier effect on the immediate impact that's obvious in terms of what impact these large fires have on the economy and the community.
And what we sometimes forget, Chris, is the compound hazard is after a fire, the potential for mudslides when the rainy season starts. We've seen devastation in Southern California after the Thomas fire, as whole hillsides came down through the coastal communities. So the danger isn't over. You speak about having a home to come home to. People might return from a fire only to lose their home in a subsequent mudslide.
Wow. So I want to turn right now to our participants for a moment and ask them another polling question or a chat question. I mean, how many of you that are watching this session right now have experienced a wildfire or know someone that has? Again, through the chat session, if you can just sort of put in yes or no, we'll try to do a quick sort of percentage. We're getting a few yeses, so seeing some yes, yes, a lot of yeses. So a lot of people that are watching this. So Maui in New Mexico. So from your experiences or what you have heard, what should be done about these? I'm still asking the polling question right now, just to sort of get a sense of what have people been told that they should do in order to protect themselves or protect their communities from wildfires? Again, if you can just answer through the chat, that'd be great. Clear brush back, defensible space and fire mitigation. Move. Great answers. Now, Janice, when I was speaking to you earlier, you had a great, what I thought was a great saying, which you said, you know, wildfires impact communities, but communities actually impact wildfires. And I think this goes sort of to that, you know, understanding of what can be done to mitigate fires and losses. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, a lot of research has been done on ember impacts on individual homes and what makes an individual home at risk. I've been looking at the effect of communities on wildfires. For example, some of the most recent events have destroyed hundreds or thousands of homes. So I wanted to ask the question, did that affect the fire itself? And I found when I simulated some of these events, for example, the Carr fire in Redding, California, as it came down the coastal mountains into the western part of Redding, as it burned this community, by considering the heat release from those structures themselves, it was so large compared to what the forest would have been that it contributed to the formation of this giant tornado that created a fire whirl that created winds over 100 miles per hour and burned through a community in the western part of town. So I can directly attribute some of the strength of that event to the burning of the community itself. So when we think about homes and how they might, how a community burns, and we look at how one house might contribute embers that damage another house. We also have to, and that, you know, of course, depends on housing density, how close they are. But the other factor we haven't been considering is how that extra heat from these closely packed houses might contribute to worsening event. And we also see similar effects like that in the Tubbs fire that burned down into the town of Santa Rosa, California. I can see by contributing the heat release from the buildings themselves, they're what caused these fire whirls that spun up in Fountain Grove and Coffee Park. And these fire whirls are more destructive because they have stronger winds and they kind of concentrate the burning and create stronger winds and loft more embers. So in a way, how you build a community can contribute to how damaged it is in a fire.
Great. I'd like to come back to that in a moment and, you know, sort of talk about planning communities and building codes. But I want to go to Kevin for a moment because I saw in the chat, you know, people talking about the importance of clearing the brush and brush fires and sort of doing it in advance. Can you talk about that, brush planning?
Yeah, adding on a little bit to what Janice was saying, one of the issues we have in Australia is a lot of the fuels and where the fires occur are on private land. So, so apart from having sort of like township fires effectively adding a lot of heat, a lot of the fuels exist on private property, and collectively that can actually add considerably to the amount of heat and energy that the fire has. So even if people were to, we normally talk about a 20 to 30 metre zone around a property. If you clear that so that fires are basically able to be fought and people are able to survive in that area, that's what I would call defendable space, or that that in itself would cause some reduction in the amount of fuel in the landscape, and that would help at a landscape level. But we do have problems along our coastal areas and our some of our edges of our metropolitan areas where a lot of the fuel in the landscape exists on private land, and there's less ability to deal with that unless the community themselves actually cooperate and deal with it. So defensible space tends to be more of a private thing, and that's really useful, but collectively as a community that will actually make a difference. And going back to something else Janet said, we found basically if houses are closer than 12 metres, so about 35 feet to each other, house-to-house ignition is quite high. So we don't even take that into account in our planning, and yet a lot of house loss in Australia has been from house-to-house ignition, and you see it in North America as well, a lot of house loss. It's not so much from the bushfire. The bushfire might start it, but then the house-to-house ignition is where the majority of the loss occurs. And of course, there's a lot more fuel in houses than there is in the surrounding forest and woodland areas.
So what can, policymakers and politicians do? Should they focus on the individual building codes, which focus more on individual buildings? Should they look at more larger community plans to prevent these fires from happening?
Yeah, well, all of the above. It's really important to have any subdivision or new development needs to be well planned, so that where the roads go, the proximity of houses to each other, where the critical infrastructure like power and water goes, all of those are important. Where a school or a hospital goes within a community is important as well, what level of exposure they might have. So that from a planning point of view, that's critical. But in a lot of instances, we've already got existing communities. So in that case, you really need the governing agencies to basically enforce a level of preparation and communication, so that individuals and communities collectively can work together to take defensive action and to protect themselves. And some of that is, as I say, important from having good messages, having good information available at the time of the fires. And firefighters often suffer from lack of information about what the fire is actually doing too. So that makes it difficult to pass on good information to the community. But people being aware, and I would think it would be really useful if some of the government agencies were also able to provide almost a rating for individual properties, so that they knew what level of bushfire risk their property actually represented, so that publicly you would be able to see where the contributing factors were coming from, and therefore if you do some mitigation works, what benefit has arisen from doing that work. So I think there's a lot that can be done at that regulatory and management level. And there seems to be, certainly in Australia, a bit of a lack of will to do that. Planning is not too bad. The building structures, we have some legislation around that, and that's helpful, but that takes generations to really fully implement. So it's the retrofitting and the dealing with the existing communities and layouts is more critical in the short term.
Janice, do you hear similar, concerns or challenges in the U.S.?
Yes, and I'm working with one entity, the First Street Foundation, that's trying to provide this fire risk rating for individual properties across the United States, just as they have for flood risk. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of factors that come together that contribute to the risk to your home, you know, ranging from these large scale factors to the things you do yourself. But I think I agree with what Kevin said, that we need to bring these home to people to look at their individual risk, but also in the context of the community at large.
Great. I want to open it up to the audience as well. If there's any questions that you would like to ask either Kevin or Janice, feel free to enter them to the chat and we can work those into the conversation as we continue here. We have probably about another 10 minutes for the session, so it'll be a good time now to ask some questions, get some final thoughts as well. So as the leading experts, is there something that I missed that I should have asked you? Janice, I'll start with you.
I guess when I was watching, when I look back at the fires in California over the past few years, I'm always struck how disproportionately the fires impact the community. I mean, you know, many people have their phones and, you know, their computers up and going, but there's so many retired people and, you know, people who are trying to live off the grid that are disproportionately impacted and might not be aware of the hazard. I think that has to be considered when communities make plans, you know. And the other thing about Paradise, I mean, if the community had grown, I don't know that many people more could have got out by the existing escape route. So my dad was a fireman, so we always had a plan, you know, where our documents were and how we were going to get out of the house and where we were going to meet. And I think that can't be reinforced enough, is how individuals can prepare. And, you know, and some of the people in Paradise, they kind of anticipated an event like that, knowing when the wind blew that someday a fire was going to bring devastation through the town. So I think there's a lot we can do individually to at least be aware of it and limit our risk, and at least try to improve our ability to survive these fires.
Thanks. Kevin, your thoughts? Anything I should have asked you?
Yeah, look, I think it's one of the things that is difficult in this area is that for most people, and I guess I'm seeing this largely from an Australian context, for most people, being burnt out in a bushfire is a once in a lifetime event. And if you're unlucky, it might be a couple of times, but that's changing now, where you may expect to see 2 or 3 major fires. When I say impacting, I'm talking about the flames and the heat sort of on your back door. You'll be impacted more broadly. But that creates a bit of a problem because, as Janice was saying, often it's more of a community problem that we see. And so it requires the individuals within that community to play their role to reduce the bushfire risk and the impacts. Communities are fantastic at sort of in the recovery mode. There's a lot of self-support, or not self-support, there's support for others in the community and so on, and people rally together. But that's when you've got a known sort of situation. People are less effective at preparing. And as Janice said, you need a plan, and you've got to have your personal plan, your family plan, as well as your community plan. And that needs to be practiced. But if it's only a once in a lifetime event, it's really hard to get people motivated to be interested in fire. As distinct from an agency that might be involved in fire management that sees it all the time, to get the individual. And we ought to be seeing that as a form of, I think, modern day volunteerism. Volunteerism has changed quite a lot, I think, in the last few decades because of people's lifestyle and how we communicate and how we commute and so on. So we need to rethink how, as a community, we behave around fire. And so there's a major social and communication sort of issue here to safeguard individuals by making communities safer. And it's not so much a technical problem. Often we need to understand the technical side of things, but often it's really understanding how people are going to behave and what they know and what information they have available to them. So the social side of this is equally as important as the physical side of fires. So, and climate change is putting more and more pressure on us and largely exposing weaknesses in our planning and our thought processes and in our systems. So there's nothing new so much, it's just that it's becoming more frequent and more extreme.
So, sort of in line with that, what you just said, Kevin, there's a question that just came up in the chat that seems to be, related to that. It says, there seems to be annual amnesia within the US and Australia public about the real threat of wildfires. For example, it happens to other people. How do you recommend messaging to private citizens the need to take self-responsibility and invest in their defensible space?
Yeah, so I have this crazy idea, and I'll be interested in Janice's comment on this, but I think in Australia, we basically have like a land tax. It's council rates that we get, we pay 4 times a year. So for the services, the roads, the rubbish collection and so on. I think it would be fantastic that if on one of those rate notices that we get, there was a classification of what our property's bushfire risk was, so that it highlights to us as an individual where we fit into the scheme. People aren't necessarily capable of understanding or doing their own assessment, but through a modelling process and using high definition remote sensing and so on, I think we could sort of give fairly detailed indications of what level of bushfire risk we have. And that level of knowledge would, I think, help turn people into action to deal with the risk. Otherwise, it's as the questioner puts it, it's really someone else's problem and it's for another time. We need to make it real, and we need to make it now, and we need to make it personal. So I think we can use some of our modelling, some of our remote sensing and so on to actually not just apply to the fire, but apply to the landscape and how we prepare and plan for these landscapes. But I'd be interested in Janice's comment on that.
That's an interesting idea. Before I let Janice figure that's interesting, because I know when I get my energy report now in the US, it tells me how much energy I spend each month, but it compares me to my neighbors. It says you relative to your neighbor, you're better or worse. So it's interesting it's an interesting concept.
Are you an energy hog, Chris?
What's that? No, I'm actually pretty good. I'm not perfect, but I'm pretty good. Janice, your thoughts on that idea?
I like what Kevin said about there's so much we can do as individuals, because it's so easy to blame it on land management or climate change that it kind of takes the onus off us to do our part in it. When we look at mechanically what caused a fire to behave what it did, in some ways the dryness made some fires perhaps spread a little faster, but it's often not, the extremeness of the fire isn't attributed to the extreme dryness or something. It's often some small scale circulation that occurred between the weather stations or smaller than the weather models could capture. So even now we don't necessarily know, it's not widely known why any fire was extreme in the way it was. So we tend to blame it on these big picture things. But so that's my homework, to continue that research. But I like what Kevin pointed out, is there's so much we can do individually, and as you pointed out, working more to do more as a community, because certainly certain parts of a community are more impacted by wildfires approaching. I mean, if you're along the edge of the community, you might have a different risk than interior, but there's a lot of variability even across a community, and maybe we can learn more about that. Mm-hmm.
Great. So we're coming to the end of our session. And I'm going to ask, again, the participants to do one thing. It's always good during a session like this to think about your one key takeaway. What was the one thing you heard, the one message that really resonates with you? And I would like to just see what people have in that. So if you could enter those into the chat room, that'd be great. And then I also want to say thank you to everyone that did join this session. I particularly want to thank, the International Fire Safety Consortium that helped me plan this session and work with me to develop that. So really want to thank them and my colleagues at FM Global that help support the back of this. So I'd like to also, just like I asked the audience members to put in their last thought, Janice, what's your one key takeaway from this discussion, and would you like to share with everyone?
I was really struck with the severity of this year. I mean, there's a lot of variability from year to year, and we shouldn't forget that. While we're talking about one place having a bad year, there's other areas that aren't. So there's really a lot of variability from year to year. But in the US, it was this persistent vapor pressure density, on top of which were some other factors, a high mortality in Southern California, and our, again, unseasonal wind events in Colorado. So it always seems like you think you've seen the worst that Mother Nature has to give, but there have certainly been some events this year that have made me go back to the drawing board and realize we still have a lot to learn about the most intense events.
Thanks. And Kevin, your one key takeaway from today?
Well, I think that we as humans can play a significant role in the future of fire in our landscape. And so we disengage fire and fire management at our peril, in a sense. So we can't just say it's climate change. We can't just say it's poor planning. We can't just say it's someone else's problem. We have to take some ownership of the problem, and we have to be helped do that. But humans can do so much, whether it's through prescribed burning across the landscape, whether it is through planning and preparations, whether it's through fire suppression activities or about good notification. But humans can play such a significant role here, and we shouldn't feel as though we're disempowered in some way. We're actually, the Aboriginals in Australia have shown that they were able to manage with a relatively low population level. They managed fire across the landscape of Australia, and yet we seem to struggle today with when we've got more than 3 times the order of magnitude of people here and resources available to us. We struggle to manage fire across the landscape, and yet the Aborigines were doing it for thousands of years before we arrived. We need to take up the task and the responsibility of managing fires, not just responding to them.
Great, thank you. I just want to remind everyone that this session has been recorded. So if anybody wants to come back and watch it later, it will be on the Understanding Risk website. And I want to take this opportunity now to really thank Janice and Kevin for joining us today, participating in this session, and sharing your expertise. And I want to leave you all with one last thought. So we're going back to where we began. At the beginning of this session, I asked you to close your eyes, think about that important building in your town, in your community, and imagine what it would feel like if that building was gone, if the whole community was gone. What we heard today, that you need to understand the risk and you need to have a plan in order to be resilient. So go out, develop that plan, and help your communities be more resilient. Thank you, everyone.